Lamelech, sing to the King. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be with you on a Wednesday evening. Let's light up the darkness. All right, we are going to keep it moving today. Let me just say at the outset, I'm dedicating today's show to my friend of blessed memory, Kevin Cameron. He was a friend from college on the rowing team. We lost him a few days ago after a long, many years battle with cancer. He will be sorely missed by his friends, his family, all his loved ones. We dedicate our learning today to Kevin Cameron. I want to keep it moving because there's a memorial service for him that I want to attend. It's starting at this time. I don't mind being late, but I don't want to miss all of it. So please be understanding with me today. So who are we welcoming to our show on this Wednesday night? Stephen in New Hampshire, John in Sedona, Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indy, Gail in Virginia, Loretta and Harold in Oregon. Crystal loves the Mordechai Ben David song, MBD. That song was Shir Lamelech, and she loves it. Tom is saying shalom. Lucy in Minnesota, Hillary in Cincinnati, Bill in Arkansas, Bitsalel in Miami, James in Indy, Nancy in Southern Pines, North Carolina got her second COVID shot. Yay. Samantha says shalom to everyone. Krista with us from Lubbock, Helena in Finland. Paula in Chicago, Sharon in New Jersey, Patrice in Utah. Tom sends condolences. Thank you. Crystal says Baruch Dayan MS. Christo, I hope you find much comfort at this time. Thank you. Renee says Baruch Dayan MS. Stephen, may his memory always be for a blessing. Thank you all very, very much. All right. Also want to mention right away, Yitzi Hurwitz's birthday is coming up. Harav Yitzi Hurwitz. So Yitzi Hurwitz is a Chabad rabbi who is an inspiration to everybody around the world. Tragically, he was diagnosed with ALS some years ago. And, you know, I know Yitzi. I've been with him at his bedside. He's locked in. He can't move any part of his body. He manages to write and to communicate with his eyes. He has a screen above his head, and with his eyes, he's able to move the cursor and communicate. And yet, he writes beautiful pieces of Torah, and he just loves it when people learn Torah or do other mitzvahs in his name. So for his upcoming birthday, there's a do mitzvahs for Yitzi campaign. They've been doing this every year now for a few years. There's an accidental Talmudist team. So the idea is, usually these kinds of campaigns are to raise money for a good cause. But for Yitzi, they're raising mitzvahs, right? So the idea is you go to the campaign page, and it's on the accidental Talmudist main page. Nina posted about it today. So there's a link there. You follow the link, and then that'll take you to the AT team on the Yitzi Horowitz Mitzvahs campaign page. And then you commit to do some mitzvahs. So I've committed. I try to give a little charity every day, and I'm committed to give extra charity, more than I would have otherwise, every day for 10 days. You can commit to put on tefillin or to help others put on tefillin, to light candles. I think it's good not just to do whatever you would have done anyway, but in Yitzi's honor, to commit to do a mitzvah that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And so it really is, for Yitzi's merit. He no longer has the use of his body so that he can do mitzvahs, and we want to do them for him. The campaign is to raise 20,000 mitzvahs. By the way, you don't have to be Jewish. You can do deeds of kindness, of loving kindness for others. Which is a commandment for all. And the idea is to get 20,000 mitzvahs done in Yitzi's honor. The AT team, we're saying we want to get at least 360 mitzvahs done from our community. So it's a beautiful thing to do. Please go there, sign up, and commit to do some good, to do a mitzvah that you wouldn't have done otherwise in Yitzi's honor. And in fact, let us pray for a miraculous a refuah shlema, a complete miraculous healing to Harav Yosef Yitzhak ben Bracha. And we say Amen. A quick word about the Shema. I've been teaching the Shema every day and adding a little thought. Today's thought comes from the great commentator Sforno, who said, we talked about already that in the Torah, the ayin at the end of the first word, Shema, listen. The ayin is enlarged in a written Torah, a Torah scroll, and so is the dalet at the end of Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The ayin at the end of Shema, the first word, and the dalet, the last letter at the end of the last word, Echad, are enlarged. Together they spell aid, witness, right? So we are meant to be witnesses. Interesting, because we always cover our eyes, close our eyes and cover them when we recite the Shema. Says Sforno, why does it say witness? What is it that we are witnessing? We are witnessing God's absolute unity and oneness throughout the world, so that we close our eyes to sort of commit to have that focus, so that when we open our eyes, we should be training ourselves to see God everywhere, in everyone, in everything. We are in God. There's no separation between this world and God. Not only is there no separation, it's not this juvenile idea that, we're here on earth and God is some old man in the sky. We're inside God. It's like we're the characters in a dream that God is having. And so therefore, every object around us is imbued with God's life-giving force. Organic and inorganic, everything is imbued by the energy of God. And so when we always stretch out the last syllable when we recite the Shema, and then we finish very emphatically on that final dalet, that letter, the fourth letter of the alphabet, dalet, which has that D sound. But we make sure to emphasize that letter. And since the letters in the Hebrew alphabet all represent numbers, Dalet is the fourth letter, so it's the number 4. We finish by saying God is one, but on this Dalet, which is the letter 4, the number 4. So says Sforno, this suggests to us the 4 primordial elements as the ancients understood them: earth, water, air, fire. In other words, the elements of everything, right? Everything around us is a chance to witness God. When we see the good, when we see the bad, when we see a bottle, when we see a rock, when we see a house, when we see a car, when we see a loved one, when we see an enemy. It's an opportunity to witness God, to witness God's oneness and absolute connectivity and God's energy in everything. So when we finish the Shema and we pronounce that Dalet, right, it includes the 4 elements which comprise everything. Let's do it together. Shema Yisroel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusah Li'olam Va'ed. All right, let us learn together. As I mentioned earlier, I would like to keep it moving today because I need to attend a memorial service that has already begun, and I can be late, but I don't want to miss all of it. Okay. Whoa. Sorry. How did that happen? That was interesting. Okay, I hope that, let me know if there's any issue with sound. I don't think there should be. Okay, so let's get it moving. All right, where are we? We are holding on Daf Pei Aleph. This is page 81 in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 7, and today we are going to complete our discussion of the 6th Mishna Yes, the sixth Mishnah, and open our discussion of the seventh Mishnah. Recall that the sixth Mishnah stated that if the Korban Pesach is brought, the Paschal offering, and after the animal is slaughtered in the temple, its meat or its blood, the meat needs to be eaten, right, by the people who brought it because it's the Paschal offering. It's an offering that's meant to be eaten by its owners. Its blood is meant to be sprinkled on the altar. So after it's slaughtered, it has to be brought in purity, it has to remain in purity, in ritual purity. But if after it's slaughtered, somehow the meat or the blood became impure, came into contact with a source of impurity, and then it was sprinkled on the altar anyway, so you might think that the offer is disqualified and the people have not fulfilled their obligation and they need to do it again, perhaps in a month at Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. But in fact, they have fulfilled their obligation because the tzitz, the front plate, the golden front plate of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, atones for this kind of error. Blood that was offered, an offering that would have otherwise been disqualified. The tzitz does not atone for every kind of error, but we're told in this Mishnah that it does atone for meat or blood of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, that became ritually impure between the time when it was slaughtered and when its blood is sprinkled on the altar. If, however, the blood or the meat remained pure, but the owner became tameh, became ritually impure, then the tzitz does not atone for that. If the person became tameh after it was slaughtered and before that blood was brought up on the altar, so then the blood should not have been sprinkled. It was done anyway. The tzitz does not atone for that error. This person is deemed not to have fulfilled their obligation to bring the Paschal offering and would be liable to bring it again and do it correctly in purity a month later at Pesach Sheni. Of course, these laws only apply when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. However, the principle there is that the tzitz atones for kind of accidental impurities, not in every case, but at least in some cases, where the impurity is part of the offering itself, not of the owner of the person who's causing it to be brought. However, the tzitz does atone if the reason that the person became tameh, became ritually impure, is because they came into contact with the mysterious Tumah of the deep, ritual impurity of the deep. We're going to talk more about what that is. Tumah of the deep, generally speaking, the sort of primary example of Tumah of the deep is that you came down a road, you walked over that road, you know you came down that road, you had no reason to suspect that there was a dead body under that road, but later, after you walked on it, came along the road workers and they were going to repave the road, and so they dug up the road, and when they dug up the road, after you walked over it, they discovered a body had been buried there. Nobody could have known about it. It wasn't your fault. You had no reason to suspect. It didn't happen to you because you were negligent. Nobody could have known. This is Tumah of the deep, right? So it's you walked over a dead body, but it's a dead body that nobody could have known was there. If you later found out that you were tameh because of that kind of tumah, the tumah of the deep, then the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, the front plate on the high priest's head, would atone for this mistake that you were in a state of tumah, of ritual impurity at the time that your Passover offering was brought in the temple and the blood was sprinkled on the altar. Okay. By the way, just note that the idea that the head plate of the high priest atones for all of these kinds of errors, it's not. It wouldn't be it's not required for the tzitz to atone for your offering being brought in a state of tumah, that the high priest himself handled your offering. There's only one front plate. It's only on the forehead of the high priest, but it's understood that it atones for these kinds of errors within the offerings of the children of Israel among the whole population, not only the ones who had that privilege of having the high priest himself bring their offering to the altar in the temple. That's our Mishnah, here Mishnah number 6 in chapter 7. Now we continue our discussion near the bottom of page Pei Aleph, Amud Aleph, right? So at the bottom of page 81. Rav Yosef, at the bottom of the A side of page 81. Rav Yosef raised a dilemma. With regard to the priest who facilitates acceptance of the daily offering, is ritual impurity of the deep permitted for him or not? So far, we've been talking about that the tzitz will atone for the owner of the paschal offering, who it turns out that he was tameh, unknown to him. He only finds out later, and it's a kind of tumah that he walked over a dead body, but never could have known. Nobody could have known. Okay, that's for him, the owner. Is this also going to atone if it turns out that the priest who brings his offering, let's say the priest who receives the blood when it is slaughtered and walks it over to the altar and sprinkles a little bit of that blood on the altar, if the priest, it turns out that he had Tumas Hatom, that he had Tumah of the deep, this ritual impurity of the deep, will the offering then still be considered valid or not? The two sides of the dilemma are as follows. If you say that the priest who facilitates acceptance of the offerings of the Nazir, so the Nazir is one who vowed not to benefit from the grapevine, neither by eating grapes, nor raisins, nor drinking wine, or any liquor made from wine, for a certain amount of time, and during that time he also cannot come into contact with a dead person. If he does, the days of his Nazirus end, and when the days of his Nazirus end, he has to bring certain offerings at the temple. So if a priest who facilitates the acceptance of the offerings of the Nazir and of the one who performs the ritual of the Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, ritual impurity of the deep is permitted for him, then in the case of the priest who facilitates acceptance of the daily offering, what is the law? So if we're saying that it is okay that the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, will atone for Tumah of the deep that attaches to the priest who helps people bring either the offerings of the Nazir or of the Paschal Lamb, if we say that it does work for him, will we also say that this works for a priest who is bringing the daily offering? So the daily offering is there's a lamb in the morning, a lamb in the evening. Every day that the temple is standing in Jerusalem, these two offerings are brought, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Actually was reading this section of the offerings this morning during morning prayers, and it's brought with a meal offering and a wine libation. That's every day, morning and afternoon. So will we say that if a priest, it turns out that he has to be tahor when he brings these offerings, but if it turns out that he was tameh, ritually impure due to this tumah of the deep, the kind of tumah that couldn't have been known about until it was discovered, are we going to say that those offerings are therefore accepted in the same way as the Paschal Lamb and the offerings of the Nazir? That's the question. Do we say that when we learn the law of impurity of the deep through an oral tradition, it was with regard to the Paschal Lamb, but with regard to the daily offering, we did not learn it? Or perhaps we can derive that the law applies to the daily offering from the fact that it applies to the Paschal Lamb, right? So can we say, well, we know this law is true for the Paschal Lamb, and can we then say, and therefore it should also attach to, to say that we do not disqualify the daily offering brought on behalf of the whole Jewish people by a priest who it turns out was tameh because of Tumah of the deep. Rabbah said, this dilemma can be resolved through a kal v'chomer, right? So in a fortiori inference, that if we apply it in a situation where it's difficult to apply, all the more we could apply it in a situation where it's easy to apply. That's one way to understand a kal v'chomer. So just as in a place where known ritual impurity is not permitted for him, For example, with regard to the Paschal lamb, for which known impurity disqualifies the offering, right? If we know that the offering is impure, or that the person bringing it is impure, or that the priest who's going to bring it is impure, that's going to disqualify the offering, so we don't do it. So known impurity disqualifies the offering, and at that point, one would have to observe Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. He has to bring his offering a month later. Nonetheless, impurity of the deep is permitted for him, then all the more so in a place where known ritual impurity is permitted for him with regard to communal offerings, as such offerings may be sacrificed even in a known state of impurity if there is no way to sacrifice the offering in a state of purity. In other words, if all the priests are impure, then we still bring that offering because the Torah says in its appointed time. So if there's no way to find a priest who is pure, we're still going to bring it. So is it not right that since we can, we're normally with the Paschal lamb, known impurity disqualifies and we have to wait for second Passover, but with the communal offerings, even when there's known impurity, there's still a chance to bring it. All the more so, this Tumah of the deep should not disqualify that offering when a priest turns out that he's tameh through Tumah of the deep. So the Gemara says, in refutation of this idea that we're going to use a kal v'chomer to extend the law of Tumah of the deep from the Passover offering to the daily offering brought in the temple, the Gemara is going to reject this proof, and it's going to say, and do we derive a kal v'chomer? Do we derive an a fortiori inference from a halacha, from a law transmitted LeMoshe Sinai, transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai? In other words, an oral teaching that was given to Moses at the same time that the written law was given, but which was not written in the Torah. So the oral laws which were given at Sinai are known as halachas LeMoshe Sinai, laws given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And we have a principle among the sages that we do not derive kal v'chomer inferences from oral teachings at Sinai, from halachas LeMoshe Sinai. Right, so say in refutation of this proof, and do we derive a kal v'chomer from a halacha LeMoshe Sinai, such as the halacha of the Tumah of the deep? Wasn't the following taught in a baraisa? Rabbi Akiva employed a kal v'chomer to derive that a Nazir must shave if he touches or carries blood, also during the days of his Naziris, the Nazir can't cut his hair. And then when he finishes it, he shaves off all his head. That's part of the vow of being a Nazir. So in this baraisa, right? So where am I? In this baraisa, Rabbi Akiva employed a kal v'chomer to derive that a Nazir must shave if he touches or carries blood, just as he must shave if he touches or carries a bone from a corpse. Right, so the Nazir cannot come into contact with the dead, with a human dead with a dead person. And if he does, his Naziris is over. It's time to shave his head and bring his offerings because his Naziris is canceled. So that's if he touches a dead body for sure. What if he touches just a little piece of a body? So we have a principle elsewhere that a little bone fragment, even if it's the size of a barley corn, that is enough for tumas hames, that you have the tumah of a corpse if you touch even just a little bone fragment the size of a barley corn. So if the Nazir comes into contact with this little bone fragment, that's it. His Naziris is over. And this is also going to apply if he comes into contact with blood. Just as he must shave if he touches or carries a bone from a corpse. And Rabbi Eliezer said to Akiva, a bone the size of a grain of barley is able to transmit tumah, ritual impurity, due to a halacha, a law transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. And you want to derive that the same is true of blood, and the minimum measure for this is a revis, a quarter log of blood, so a certain volume, about like this much of blood. on the basis of this Kal V'chomer inference. And one may not derive a Kal V'chomer inference from a halacha leMoshe Sinai. So the reason we're learning there about the bone the size of a barley corn and extending that principle to a cup of blood is just to get this ruling from Eliezer to remind us that we do not derive a Kal V'chomer from a halacha leMoshe Sinai. We don't derive this kind of inference, extending the law from one area of the law to another, from an oral teaching given directly to Moses at Sinai. Rather, Rava said it is derived. So if we're going to say that the Nazir ends his Nazirus if he comes into contact with blood, we're not going to do it by a Kal V'chomer from the law of coming into contact with a little bone fragment. Rather, Rava said it is derived on the basis of a verbal analogy. That's a Gezerah Shava. Of the expressions its appointed time stated with regard to the Paschal lamb and its appointed time stated with regard to the daily offering. Since the Torah uses this expression in both cases, the halacha with regard to the daily offering can be derived from the halacha in the case of the Paschal lamb. Just as impurity of the deep is permitted with regard to the Paschal lamb, it is permitted with regard to the daily offering. So we're not going to use the Kal V'chomer sequence, since it would be a Kal V'chomer based on a halacha leMoshe Sinai. Rather, we're just going to look at two written verses in the Torah, which both have this language in its appointed time. And since the Tumah Hatom, the Tumah of the deep, is not going to disqualify the one bringing the Paschal offering, it also will not disqualify the one bringing the daily offering. Now, with respect to this principle that we don't derive, we don't by inference new laws from laws given orally to Moses at Mount Sinai, we have a note from Rav Steinsaltz. The hermeneutical principle of the Kal V'chomer, translated using Latin and or Greek, I'm not sure, and a fortiori inference, is one that is simple and logical. The principle that an a fortiori inference is not derived from a law transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai is not the consequence of any deficiency in the principle of the a fortiori inference. Rather, it is due to the unique nature of laws transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. The difference between laws written explicitly in the Torah and those transmitted orally to Moses at Mount Sinai is not related to their source of authority. Both come from God directly to Moses. One was transmitted, Moses, write this down, and it became part of the written Torah. And there's some other laws, like what is tefillin or what is matzah, which were given to Moses orally at Mount Sinai, and he had to then teach Joshua, and Joshua taught the elders, and the elders taught the judges, and the judges taught the prophets, and the prophets taught the rabbis, and the rabbis have passed it down ever since. That is the chain of transmission. So the authority is there. It's not a question of authority. Rather, it is related specifically to the utilization of a law as a model for other laws. Halachas, laws written in the Torah, may serve as models for other laws as well. But halachas, laws transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai orally, were transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai orally because they were somehow special or unique, and we wouldn't know what they were if they hadn't been transmitted orally. But their very uniqueness, these laws were special laws. It's not like a huge number of them, but the laws that were given by God to Moses orally were given that way because they are special laws, and we don't learn out we don't extend by analogy those laws to other areas of laws because of their very specialness, and that's why they were given by God to Moses at Sinai. The Gemara asks, and with regard to impurity of the deep itself, which is permitted in the cases of a Nazir and one who sacrifices the Paschal lamb, due to the fact that the tzitz, the front plate of the high priest, appeases God for the impurity, where is it written? How do we know this law that the tzitz atones for Tumah of the deep, in the cases of the offerings of the Nazir and the Paschal lamb? Rabbi Elazar said that the verse states with regard to a Nazir, Numbers 6:9, and if any man shall die very suddenly beside him. Right? So this is the idea that one who's in his vow, in the days of his vow, to abstain from wine and from coming into contact with the dead, to kind of just keep himself on this higher level of purity than is required of anybody. He's taking it on as an act of piety for a certain amount of time. But then the Torah says, but if somebody should happen to die right next to you, and accidentally you come into contact with this dead body, right, then what? Then your Nazirus ends, and you have to bring your offerings, and that's it. So the emphasis provided by the expression beside him, and should a person die beside him, beside the Nazir, the one who takes that vow, indicates that it is clear to him that he has become impure. However, one is not impure if the presence of the corpse is unknown. That's the Tumah Satom, the Tumah of the deep. So the idea is, according to Rabbi Elazar, when the Torah says that when the Nazir comes into contact with a dead body, because it says these words beside him, that one should die beside him, Rabbi Elazar learns out from that that it has to be clear to the Nazir that he came into contact with a dead body. And the example that we've given, that you walk along a road and only later when they excavate that road in order to do road repair and they find a dead body under it, nobody could have known that. It certainly wasn't clear to the Nazir that he came into contact with or walked over, because you also get Tumas and Mace that way if you walk over a grave, but he couldn't have known that. It was not clear to him. The Gemara asks, we found a source for impurity of the deep with regard to a Nazir. From where do we derive that impurity of the deep is also permitted with regard to one who performs the ritual of the Paschal lamb? Rabbi Yochanan said that the verse states, any man of you, lachem, any man of you who shall be ritually impure due to a corpse or on a road far away. That's Numbers 9:10. And this is where it says that if you are impure or far away, right, so then you're not there to bring the Paschal lamb, or you're in a state of impurity and therefore you're disqualified from bringing the lamb, the Paschal lamb. So then you would be liable to bring it a month later at the second Passover. Pesach Sheni. But because it says any man of you, right, this word of you, lachem, you plural, who shall be ritually impure due to a corpse on a road far away, in this verse, the term lachem is interpreted as indicating that the impurity must be clear to you, lachem. However, any ritual impurity that is not clearly identified does not render one who wishes to sacrifice the Paschal lamb impure. Tumas hatom, right? So the Tumah of the deep is not evident to you. You don't know that you came into contact with impurity. So when you then bring the offering and find out later that you were tameh, but with this impurity that you couldn't have known about, the Tumas hatom, the Tumah of the deep, so then it's not going to be disqualified. The tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, the front plate of the Kohen Gadol, will atone for that error, and you're good. You have already fulfilled your obligation the first time you brought the Paschal lamb, and you don't have to bring it again at Pesach Sheni. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, this halacha, this law, may be derived in a different way from the word road, which is juxtaposed in the verse to the phrase ritually impure. This indicates that the impurity is like a road. Just as a road is in the open, so too the impurity is in the open. And if it's not in the open, then you're not going to be disqualified because of it. The Gemara raises an objection to these derivations from that which was taught in the following Baraisa. The Baraisa says, which is the impurity of the deep that was permitted for both a Nazir and one who sacrifices the Paschal lamb? Now we start to define, well, what counts as Tumah of the deep? What actually counts as Tumah of the deep? There's a lot of situations which we might call Tumah of the deep, But are they really Tumah of the deep? It is impurity imparted by any corpse of which no one is aware, even at the end of the earth. But if even one person is aware of it, so it's not enough that you didn't know, right? Just because you didn't know that you stepped over a dead body doesn't mean that you're excused. That's not Tumah Satom, right? For it to be actually Tumah of the deep, nobody can know that there was a body there until the body is discovered. However, according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who said that the expression beside him indicates that the impurity must be clear to him, it would be considered impurity of the deep until he knew about it. It would not be enough for some other person to be aware of the corpse. So which is it? Is it Tumas Hatom? Is it Tumah of the deep if it's just, it was unknown to you that you came into contact with it? Or is it only going to be considered Tumah of the deep if no one in the world knew about it? Which is it? According to Rabbi Yochanan, who said that the halacha, the law, is derived from the term lachem, which teaches that it must be clear to you, it is considered impurity of the deep until two people know about it, as the word lachem is plural. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who said that the impurity must be like a road. It is impurity of the deep until the entire world knows about it. If anybody doesn't know about it, it could still be considered impurity of the deep. That's according to the opinion of Shimon ben Lakish as it's interpreted here. Rather, one must conclude that the previous sources cited are insufficient and say that they learned the principle of impurity of the deep as a halacha transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. And the verse that the Amoraim quoted is a mere support for the halacha and not its actual source. So now it seems that this idea that the tzitz is going to atone for offerings that are brought in a state of impurity that was contracted through Tumah of the deep, so that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And it seems like maybe the definition of what counts as Tumah of the deep is also given at Mount Sinai. So let's go forward. Before I read the law, let me just read the last three lines of this page before we get to the next Mishnah. So in what case is this statement that a Nazir and one bringing the Paschal lamb are considered pure? When is that said? It is said with regard to impurity of the deep. However, if the source of impurity was known to some, but not the individual who became impure, he is nevertheless impure, right? So it really has to be that no one knows about it. The Baraisa continues, and which corpse is considered impurity of the deep? Any corpse of which no one is aware, even at the end of the earth. But even if one individual is aware of it, even if that individual is at the end of the earth, this is not considered Tumah of the deep. In order to ascertain whether anyone ever knew about the corpse, its condition is taken into account. If one finds the corpse hidden in hay or in dirt or in pebbles, and it is possible that the person died in an avalanche, in which case it is likely that the corpse had never been found, this is impurity of the deep. But if we find the corpse in water, or in a dark place, or in the clefts of the rocks, this is not Tumah of the deep. Although these are places where people do not often go, with the passage of time, the corpse is likely to be discovered, and it is quite possible that someone already passed by and saw it. And they said the leniency of impurity of the deep only with regard to a corpse, but not with regard to other sources of ritual impurity. And the law on this matter is like this: the impurity of the deep is imparted by a source of impurity of which no one is aware. Therefore, the corpse of one who was killed cannot be considered impurity of the deep because the killer is aware of that corpse, right? So if a murderer disposed of a body by burying it, right, under a path through the woods, and then people walked over that path, right, and then later it was discovered when they did some, construction to build a new house there, if they could ascertain that the body that was buried there was, murdered, so then it didn't end up there by accident, somebody knew about it, and all the people that walked over it, their tumah is not tumah of the deep. And so if they learned that they were tameh after the offering was brought for them on Passover, even a week later, they found out, oh my gosh, when I brought the offering to Jerusalem, I actually was tameh and I didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it, but the murderer knew, who stashed that body there. So then these people have not fulfilled their obligation, and they're liable to bring the Passover offering again at second Passover, Pesach Sheni, a month later. I'm almost done. If you've got questions or comments, put them in now. As I mentioned earlier, I need to go to a memorial service via Zoom, so I want to keep the class somewhat short today. I'm just going to read the next Mishnah. This is Mishnah number 7 here in chapter 7, and just do the very opening of its discussion. The Mishnah goes like this: if the whole Paschal lamb, or most of it, became tameh, became ritually impure, one burns it before the temple with wood from the arrangement of wood on the altar that was given to the owners of the Paschal lamb for this purpose. So now we're discussing, okay, well, let's say that we found out that our offering had become tameh. Let's say after we slaughtered it, and it became tameh, so now we can't eat it, right? So it's no good. What do we do with it? So now we're discussing, what do we do with it? It can't be eaten. It can't just be left there. So it needs to be consumed by a fire. What kind of a fire? So if it happens, right? So if the whole lamb or most of it became tameh, so one burns it before the temple. So like near the temple, and you can get wood that's specially there. It's property of the temple, this wood that can be used for these kinds of fires for this purpose. If a minority of the offering became impure, and similarly with regards to the parts of the Paschal lamb that are left over. We've discussed that it's a teaching that when you bring the Paschal lamb, when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, okay, so it gets slaughtered in the temple, a little bit of its blood is received by a priest, walked over to the altar, sprinkled on the altar, then the owners take it out of the temple compound, they bring it back to the group who are registered to eat it together that night, Passover night. They eat it that night. If it's a big lamb in a small group, they might have leftovers. Those leftovers, when the sun comes up the next morning, they cannot be there anymore. You can only eat it that night, and whatever you don't eat that night needs to be consumed by a fire. It needs to be burned up in a fire. You don't keep leftovers for the next day of the Paschal lamb. It's a very special offering and unique in that sense. Whatever you don't eat that night needs to be burned before the next morning. So we treat a small amount of the lamb that became impure, like a discernible amount that could be separated from the lamb, or whatever leftovers there are. What do we do with them? A minority of it became impure, and similarly with regards to the parts of the Paschal lamb that are left over, which must be burned, the owners of the Paschal lamb burn it in their own courtyards or on their roofs with their own wood. They don't use wood from the temple property. They don't do it at the temple. They can do it where they are. And it makes sense because they took the lamb to eat, wherever they were going to eat it around Jerusalem. And then once they're done, they don't have to walk back to the temple to dispose of what's left over. They can burn it right where they are. And in fact, they had a fire that they used to roast it, so, it's handy. It's right there for the disposal fire. Only the miserly, meaning the cheap people, who want to save the expenditure of wood, burn it before the temple in order to benefit from the wood of the arrangement. That's the Mishnah. And the Gemara says, the Gemara asks, what is the reason that the Paschal lamb must be burned before the temple, and that those who prefer to burn it elsewhere are not permitted to do so? So this is in the case of where the whole lamb became impure, where the whole lamb or most of it became impure, and then they said you should burn that at the temple. What is the reason that it must be burned before the temple, and those who prefer to burn it elsewhere are not permitted to do so? Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina said, in order to embarrass them. Presumably, the reason that most of the offering became impure is because the owners were not sufficiently careful with it. Therefore, the sages decreed that it be burned in a public place. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. It may not be to embarrass them. How did it happen, right? If they really just weren't careful, because what happened, right? They kept the offering pure. They brought it to the temple. It was slaughtered. The blood was sprinkled on the altar, etc. Now all they needed to do was carry it without coming into contact with any source of impurity back to their group who's waiting for it so that they can celebrate the Passover night and eat this lamb, which they are commanded to do. And somehow between the time that it was slaughtered and it was brought back, it came into contact with all kinds of impurity, and now they can't eat it and it has to be burned up. So they're going to do it at the temple. One reason, according to Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina, is to embarrass them because they should have been more careful. Maybe another reason is because there was some kind of really unexpected event. It wasn't their fault, but it was, kind of tragic, and they need to be really moved by it, and so they're going to deal with it at the Temple Mount. Hard to say. There's going to be more discussion about this, but not between us tonight, because as I said, I got to keep it moving. All right, let me see if there's comments or questions about this. Okay. Tom says, does it matter if the body is 10 feet deep or 50 feet or 100? It's a great question, Tom. I'm pretty sure that Tumah Hames, the Tumah of a corpse extends up infinitely above a grave. I don't think it matters how deep the grave is. I could be wrong. I haven't read up on that law that recently, but that's my impression. You'd have to check it out. And Sharon says, if the murder occurred decades before, it is possible that no one did know, as the murderer might now be dead as well. Can it then qualify? That's a great question. I don't know. It would seem that somebody knew, we know that somebody knew at one time. You're right, that person could be dead, but we're not sure if he's dead. So, I suspect that in the case, it seems to be a principle that if it's the corpse of a murder victim, it's not going to qualify as Tumah Satom, Tumah of the deep. And they don't seem to make that qualification of how long ago, because maybe the murder is gone too, since we can't know that. But it's a good question. Okay, that's what I've got time for today. Please excuse me, I want to go to this memorial service. I'm sending you all my love, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Thursday night, for Daf Pei Beis, for page 82 here in Tractate Pesachim.